Good morning, everyone out there in YouTubeville.
I feel like I'm going to sneeze.
Let's hear it. Everyone out in YouTube land. Landia? What is it?
Ville.
You sure?
It passed. I'm good.
In the YouTube villa. Hope you're having a great week.
Good morning.
It's been a good week for us so far. We are enjoying being out of volleyball and having less things to go to every single day.
It's like we got our life back.
Yeah, we went on a surprise date last night.
Yes.
Yesterday afternoon. We
had a free evening.
So we drove 45 minutes south to New Smyrna Beach, and hit up a restaurant and walked around the beach in the little town. Just had a good time.
Yep. Thomas let me get coffee, and we sat together in a cute little coffee shop and just talked.
We did. We actually talked not about the podcast itself, but we did what we tell everybody else to do in this podcast episode. Talked about sex.
We did in a coffee shop, but it was a very, it had little nooks. So we had privacy.
Which, reminder, and we'll remind our podcast listeners as well. If you're listening to this with your children around, you may want to put the headphones in or watch it at a later time because we are talking about sex today.
Yes, we are. And this is a topic that people, I think, have been wanting. People are wanting this topic because this is a real issue in marriages, and
people definitely want sex. You're right.
They also want to hear about sex. So we're giving the people what they want.
Yeah, you have to, right?
Yes.
You have to give them what they want.
That's right. So that's what today's episode is on. We ready to get into it, babe?
I am always ready to get into it. Are you talking about sex or the podcast?
Okay, let me just set up a few ground rules. Excuse me.
You talking about sex or the podcast?
Watch your behavior today.
I'm trying.
No innuendos. No, that's what she said.
I'm kind of insulted that you think that would come from me. Last time we had talked about this this
content topic?
Yes, yeah, that.
I'm the writer in the group.
Yes, you are. But you were the one who went off the rails last time we talked about this subject. So
I did. I had a problem. But okay, but usually you are the problem.
So I need to lay down some ground rules. First of all, you're not allowed to say the word orgy in the podcast like you did last time.
I didn't think that was going to be a problem last time. Honestly, it surprised me. I want to apologize to everyone. I will work on that.
I had people texting me like,
I know.
Oh, she really just went off the rails. Like, what are you going to do? And it's hard to control this woman.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's hard. Okay. It's difficult to talk about sex.
See?
And not because things just come out of your mouth and you're talking and oh my gosh. Can we please just do this episode and get it over with?
I think you're going to have
now very stressed out.
I think you are going to have a very hard time.
I was chill until now. Okay, start this episode. Start it.
All right. This goes out to all of you in YouTube land. Bill. What did you say it was?
I said Bill.
Okay.
You said Landville.
Yeah. YouTubians.
YouTubians, yes.
Gather round, everybody. It's time for a family meeting. The family meeting is a show that's all about family relationships. We're Ostercamps.
Yes, we are.
I'm Thomas. This is my wife, Lysandra.
Hello, and welcome to our family. Welcome to episode 109 of the Family Meeting Podcast. On today's episode, we are going to talk about a racy subject. We're going to talk about sex.
So, if you're listening to this in the car or with your kids around, just a little heads up. You may want to just secure the area.
This is not the podcast that you should listen to with your children.
Unless you're ready to have conversations.
Even then, I don't recommend it. We're going to get into some details today.
Well, and just a couple weeks ago, we did the Sweet Talk weekend over at Fellowship for them. And this podcast episode is born out of one of our talks from that.
Session 2. It was the infamous Session 2.
Because we had, and when you go into these different churches, or conventions or whatever, you have such a wide variety of people and backgrounds, so you don't really know what their thoughts are going to be when you start to talk about sex in a public forum. But we had so much positive feedback
Yes.
on session 2 that we needed to make sure that it got out there to all of our podcast listeners as well.
That's right.
So if you were at the Sweet Talk weekend, thank you for kind of being the test run on
Right.
what we're going to talk about today.
Yes. Okay. So when we say we're going to talk about sex, we're talking about sex. Okay. We are going to talk about communicating in your sex life. And growing up, I almost never heard preaching or teaching on sex. And the few times that I can remember that it was talked about in a church setting, it was to talk about how bad and sinful it was. It was in the context of fornication. It was evil, wicked. And so it has taken me years to be comfortable enough to say the word sex, because growing up, it was almost like a bad word.
Yeah. And
So-
now you're saying all kinds of things.
Yeah, you just like,
Go back a few episodes, and I thought I was going to be the one who was going to cause problems on this topic, but it really was you.
it was me, but I don't even know how to defend myself.
Just try, because that's so fun.
Yeah, thanks.
But when I have people from across the country texting me like, I can't believe your wife just said that
I know.
on the podcast.
It got away from me. You know what it was? I know exactly why. Because you came up with an illustration mid-podcast that was not in our notes. And so you led us down a road that I was not prepared for. And
Yeah, but that's your whole life.
yeah, I know.
So you should be prepared for
I
it.
should be prepared for the unexpected with you. You are a spontaneous, very interesting man.
For instance, when we were giving this session at the Sweet Talk, and I came up with the illustration of watching game film.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I thought, I was like, are you telling them to tape you?
I mean, you can. And
Yeah.
we'll talk about that like later on.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where I'm in the moment and a great thought or illustration comes to mind, and I just got to get it out there to everybody.
I know. And then you throw me off and I'm off script and I'm going crazy.
Yep. I work best. My best work is off the script.
Yeah. That's probably true.
Throw the notes away and let's just
yeah.
communicate.
That's my worst. That's worst for me. It's
But what you're saying is right, because I don't know that I ever heard a positive talk or sermon about sex in church. Ever. And I just want to say we are Christians, so we come at this from a biblical perspective. And one of the things that we know, going all the way back to the book of Genesis, is God is the one who created sex.
yeah.
And for all of you out there who come from multiple backgrounds, some of you from very conservative backgrounds, similar to what we grew up with, where you've only ever heard negative things about it, I am here to tell you sex is good.
Okay.
In fact, it's great. And what we want to do today, some of you got very uncomfortable when I said that,
Yes, we
including
did.
Lysandra. But on today's episode, what we want to do is we want to help you to become more comfortable talking about sex with your spouse. And we want to kind of give you some tips on how to be vulnerable when discussing your sex life with your spouse, and how to get to the place where the two of you are comfortable and even enjoy talking about sex.
Yeah.
And I think about just last night, Lysandra and I went on an impromptu date night where we drove about 45 minutes away and went to a restaurant. We walked on the beach, walked around the little town of New Smyrna Beach, had a great time. And we stopped at a coffee shop for Lysandra and got a coffee, and we sat down and talked, and we just, the topic of sex came up. Because we've got 4 children, and sometimes figuring out the right time that we can have sex is complicated.
Yeah. We need to soundproof our walls or something. It's just, you can just hear everything in this house.
So we're here outside of this coffee shop and just having a conversation about it, and then most of the ride home we were talking about it. And it's a topic that we're open to discuss with one another, and we think that you ought to be open to discussing it with your spouse as well.
And being open and talking about it between the two of us has improved our sex life so rapidly. Like, it went from 0 to 100 very quickly because we have always been able to talk about this and improve it through communication.
And one of the things we noticed over the years in ministry and counseling with married couples is how often sex is a problem in marriage because of a lot of different reasons. And so one of the things that we did in our premarital counseling is we added a session just about sex, which is always an interesting session for the couple to be.
Yeah, the engaged couple have to talk about sex, and
everyone's uncomfortable in that room but me.
Yeah, you're pretty
the
comfortable.
The couple is uncomfortable. Lysandra's uncomfortable. But we feel like it's caused so many problems in so many marriages that we want to try to get out in front of that with these couples and give them the tools that they need to be able to talk about it. And so some of the things we're going to talk about today might be things that you've never talked about in your marriage. Well, it's time to have these conversations about your sex life. And if you are communicating openly like you should, it'll take care of most of the problems you're having with this issue, or at least be able to help you navigate them better. So in 1 Corinthians chapter number 7, the Apostle Paul's writing, and I like to make sure everybody knows when we start to look at this portion of Scripture, 1 Corinthians here is a letter that Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth. And he wrote this letter in response to a letter that church had sent to him. Now, we don't have the letter they sent to Paul. So there's information missing that we don't know that he is responding to. So first of all, we want to be careful about coming up with whole doctrines or philosophies or teachings on how Paul is responding, because we don't know the specifics of what he's responding to. Now, we can learn and take away some principles from it, but like this verse in chapter 7, verse number 1, is a verse I remember hearing as a teenager preached over and over again in multiple places that's totally taken out of context. Being preached to teenagers to stay pure when it's not even written to single people.
Right.
So verse number 1 says this: "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now, if we just take that at face value, not understanding, hey, they wrote Paul a letter about a very specific situation, and Paul is answering that letter, we just take that one verse and build this whole false idea around it, when I know from experience,
oh my gosh,
that it is very good to touch a woman. Okay? Specifically my wife.
Thank you for that.
Just want to clarify.
Good.
For those who are listening.
I'm glad you clarified for all of us.
So it is a very good thing. One of my favorite things about being married, in fact. So then he continues on. "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband." So he's talking about having sex with each other. "The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife." Then he says, "Defraud you not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment." And so he's talking about answering this letter, but we can learn some things about a sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. And he talks about the fact that, hey, we owe some things. We're responsible to meet the sexual needs of our partner. So as a husband, I'm going to meet the sexual needs of my wife. Lysandra's responsibility is to meet the sexual needs of her husband. That's me. And he talks about verse number 4, how we don't have power of our own bodies. And once again, some people have taken things like verse number 4 and saying, hey, anytime you want to have sex, you can just have sex. It doesn't matter if they want to or not, because you have power over their own body. Mm-mm. And it's like, well, if you really think this through, okay, if you think this through, let's just have a conversation. Let's say I want to have sex, Lysandra doesn't. And so I use this verse to say, hey, you don't have power of your own body. I do, so you have to have sex with me. Well, just think what he just said here. He said, also, I don't have power over my body, but the wife. So she can say, hey, guess what? I don't want to have sex, and you don't have power of your own body. I do, so we're not. But they like to take that verse and just use it so that most of the time a husband can just use and abuse his wife, which is totally against the teaching of Scripture.
Yeah, and we have to take every Bible verse and compare it with other Bible verses. It's all about what is the heart of God. And over again, we see in Scripture, love one another, put other people ahead of yourself constantly. That is the principles and the commands that we find in Scripture. So you pair that with this passage, and it's very obvious that's not what he's trying to say.
Well, and speaking of loving one another, Paul wrote to the Ephesians, and he said, hey, husbands, you are to love your wife like Christ loved the church and gave himself for it.
Yes.
So Christ did not use the church for just his own pleasure or benefit or whatever else. He sacrificed himself for the church. Mm-hmm. And as a husband, I'm not to just use and abuse my wife for my own pleasure or whatever else. I am to sacrifice for my wife. And we always teach, no matter what kind of relationship it is. Now, we think from Scripture you should only be having sex if you're married and only with each other. But whatever the relationship is, sex should always be by consent with both parties.
Amen.
No matter what.
That's right. So I love this fire illustration that Paul Chappell gives. I'll share it very briefly before we get into this communication about sex. But the fire illustration is that sex is like fire. And I have shared this so many times because when I first read this really helped me to understand that it's okay to enjoy sex. It's okay. Sex is made by God.
So are you hot right now?
What?
Are you hot right now? There's fire. Sex is fire? Are you hot?
Shh, stop talking. Shh. Okay, so actually I'm a little chilly. I am actually
I was going to say, that's definitely a no then.
The AC must be on today, and it's kind of a chilly day in Florida. Okay, so sex is like a fire, and if a fire has no boundaries, it's like a forest fire. It destroys. It brings devastation. It brings pain, suffering, and death. And that is what sex is like when you have no boundaries. Just having sex with anyone you want, anytime you want, multiple partners, there are no boundaries. It is going to bring destruction and devastation. But sex, when it is contained in the boundaries, such as a fireplace, it's contained in the hearth. It brings what? Warmth. It brings closeness, heat, health. It brings comfort and life. So sex is created by God, but God created the boundaries of sex as well. Mm-hmm. And so if we keep sex in those proper boundaries, it is a very, very good thing. It is when we get rid of the boundaries and we say, I don't care about the boundaries. I'm going to do my own thing. That's when sex becomes destructive and can be a bad thing. So the first thing we want to talk about as far as communicating in sex is talk before you have sex. Okay? Talk before. Now, most of our episode today is going to center around this first point of talking before. And we want to share with you some good issues to talk about before you get married and begin having sex. But maybe you're already married and you missed that boat. You didn't have an opportunity to talk about sex before you got married. It's not too late. Don't be like, well, we missed it. Too bad. No. Rather, take a step away, go on a coffee date.
Yeah.
Get some coffee and find a private spot and talk about it. Maybe it's in your bedroom, maybe it's pillow talk, okay? But find the opportunity that you need to talk about these things that really should be talked about before you start having sex with each other. But go ahead and have the conversation now, okay? And when we do premarital counseling with couples who are engaged, we encourage all couples in our premarital counseling sessions to discuss past sexual experiences with their soon-to-be forever and only sexual partner. This is really important, okay? So you need to be talking about every past sexual partner. This is incredibly important. Remember that we need to talk in a way that is deep, not just shallow. How's the weather? Who's going to take the kids to volleyball? Okay, we have to talk in a way and communicate deeply with one another, and this is one way to do that. So your spouse should know about every kiss. Whoa, some of you that's like, oh, I got a lot to talk about. Well, have some dates. Go through it. Talk it out.
And what you can remember, because you may not be able to remember them all.
Absolutely. But the things that you can remember probably haven't had an impact in your life in some way, and your spouse should know about it.
Yeah.
Every sexual experience that you've had of any kind, your spouse should know about that. Why? Because there shouldn't be secrets between the two of you.
Yeah.
And the past sexual experiences that you need to talk about, this includes sexual abuse. If you have experienced any sexual abuse, this should be a part of the conversations that you have before you have sex. So make sure that you are talking about your past sexual experiences, including sexual abuse.
Well, and sexual abuse is such a prevalent issue in our culture today. Mm-hmm. So just want to share some statistics with you from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So these are some of the statistics that they share right on their website. 1 in 5 women in the United States experience completed or attempted rape during their lifetime.
Wow.
So that's 20% of all the women that you know have either had somebody attempt to rape them or they were raped. That's such a big deal.
Yeah.
What about men? Nearly a quarter. So almost 25% of men in the United States experience some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. And men are a lot less likely to talk about it, I think, than women are. But overall, as a culture, it's a topic that we don't want to talk about, but we really need to. Nationwide, 81% of women and 43% of men reported experience some form of sexual harassment and or assault in their lifetime. Wow. Talking about over 80% of women have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. So it's an issue that needs to be brought up and needs to be talked about.
That's right. And talking about sexual abuse is something that should be talked about before you have sex. And this was relevant for us because I was sexually abused as an adolescent. And I had to tell Thomas about this. Now, thankfully, we knew enough to talk about this topic before we got married through the premarital counseling that we had. And so we knew going into marriage that this was an issue. And so I was able to tell Thomas about it. He had to know, and he had to know the details. He had to know when it happened, how many times it happened, what was done, and what makes me uncomfortable because of that abuse.
Well, and Lysandra shared her story with me, but I also had to share my story with her because I'm in that 25%, having experienced sexual abuse in my own past. Mm-hmm. So these were conversations that we had to share with each other. And we need to have that information because things like this affect your sexual relationship.
Yes.
And so you can't just walk into a relationship expecting to have a natural sexual relationship if you've not talked about these things. You're going to cause problems and sometimes even stir up some flashbacks and some other feelings by your words, by your touch, by your behavior, by your music. You know, if you're unaware of what has taken place in the life of your partner, And it's amazing to me the things that will trigger those thoughts and experiences from my past.
Right, because it's a trauma.
It is a trauma that takes place. So there are certain things that happen, and it's like everyday normal things.
Right.
But when I come in contact with it, it brings all that back, and I can feel my blood pressure just like shoot through the roof. My skin gets hot, and it's just because it brings all those things back. And I needed to understand fully what Lysandra had been through so that I was not doing things to trigger those flashbacks for her.
Right. We can, once we have all the information, we can avoid those triggers. If we don't have the information, we have no way of avoiding those triggers. So if your spouse is doing something in your sex life that is upsetting you and it's bringing that trauma back over and over, it isn't their fault if you haven't told them. You have to bring it up. You have to talk about this before the next time you have sex.
Well, and it gives you an opportunity to be sensitive to your spouse's needs. Mm-hmm. And if either one of us had kept this information hidden from each other, then we'd have no idea what triggers one another and brings those memories and those awful feelings back again. And that would negatively impact our sexual relationship just over and over and over again. And so this is not talked about a lot. And so when we cover the issue of sexual abuse, and we're talking about, okay, when you need to have these conversations before you have sex. So if you're dealing with somebody who's had sexual abuse, and sometimes it can be very severe trauma. I mean, you talk about the statistics they gave on the number of women who have been attempted rape, or completed rape. It's just astronomical. And then you add in the 80% of women who've had to deal with this in some way, shape, or form. It can be tough for them to have a sexual relationship. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we encourage in having a conversation is you may have to take it really slow with your partner. Mm-hmm. And you're communicating and saying, hey, you know what? We're just gonna this is how this makes me feel. This is what I think about, and all those sorts of things. But you've got to openly communicate about it. And if you've not talked about this with your partner yet, then you need to. If you've not asked the questions yet, it's time to ask the questions. But one of the things that you have to talk about as well is how frequently you want to have sex.
Yeah.
And sex drive and all those sorts of things. Your spouse needs to hear from you verbally how often you're wanting sex. And you can't hint or hope they just know when you're needing sex. You have to speak words plain and clear. And I think about us in our own life. I just don't take subtle hints.
No.
Not at all.
You do not. Yeah.
I need plain, clear, show me the signs, like explain it very clearly to me.
Right.
And we've talked in the past about the fact that I struggle with depression. And so one of the side effects of that can be a lower sex drive. And there was a time in one of the seasons I was going through where my sex drive just kind of tanked. And I didn't know how to communicate that, or that I really needed to. And because of that, Lysandra just assumed I didn't want to have sex because she was fat.
Yep.
That's your go-to for
That's my go-to for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here, because I'm not communicating openly the way that I need to, she's having all these thoughts and feelings. And so now, because of my lack of communication, I'm affecting her life. And it was, it was me not talking about, hey, this is affecting my sex drive. And once again, partially because I didn't realize what was happening for a while. But once I realized it, hey, we need to have those conversations. We need to be open about it.
Yeah, and I think that the way that we realized it is someone else was sharing with us that when they went through a season of depression, their sex drive was just gone. And we were both, it was like light bulbs went on above our head where we were like,
finally 2 and 2 equaled 4.
Yeah, exactly. We finally figured it out. And that was a huge relief to me because I took that burden on my own shoulders that it was my fault that Thomas was not as interested in sex. Like, I got fat, I got ugly, I got unattractive, he wasn't wanting me, And then of course starts the doubt of like, is he getting it from somewhere else? And oh my goodness, if we don't talk about sex drive and what's happening, then your spouse is going to go ahead and make up their own ideas.
Yeah. They'll come to their own conclusions.
Yes. So be the one to tell them what the truth is. And another thing to think about with this whole idea of sex drive and talking about it is, I was recently talking with a woman, and she's premenopausal, and her sex drive has not just slowed down, but it's completely gone. There is no sex drive. And this is something that her husband really needs to know. And so maybe that's what's going on in your life. Something in you hormonally has changed, and your sex drive has changed. Don't just fake it or, just keep going through the motions. Talk about it. You need to give that information to your spouse.
Yeah, and that gives your spouse then an opportunity to be sensitive to your needs and what you're going through. Mm-hmm. We are a team, and Scripture talks about man and woman becoming one flesh, and that means that they deserve and need all the information that you have with what's going on in your head, your mind, your body, your life.
Yes.
And then they can respond in an appropriate manner. But if you're just, hey, I have zero desire to have sex anymore, and you're not talking about that, like that's an issue that needs to be dealt with, because sex is a big deal in relationships.
Yes.
It's not everything. Mm-hmm. So, but it can cause a lot of problems. And so once again, communicating openly will help you to be able to navigate through some of these issues before it becomes a huge deal.
And really, there are practically a million variables that can affect your sex drive.
Oh my gosh, yes.
It can be health issues. People who have chronic health issues have a very difficult time in their sex life, in their marriage. And that needs to be talked about. Okay, this is how sex makes me feel. This is how it affects my health. Or because of my health, I can't have sex or don't want to. What can we do instead of sex itself? What else can we do?
Well, and it goes back to those verses we read from Paul and talked about the fact that, hey, as a husband, as a wife, one of your responsibilities is to meet the sexual needs of your spouse. So even if I'm having my own issues, then I still need to provide for the needs of my wife, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that can affect sex drive is pain. People who are in severe pain. And we experienced this when I had back pain for several months.
It was 11 months.
11 months. You were counting, huh?
I was counting.
And it wasn't that we couldn't have sex during that time, but we had to be very careful, and it was just very difficult. And we weren't as close physically, like leading up to sex either, because sometimes any touch would hurt me.
And so that affected our sex life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we weren't close. So be talking about that. It could be emotional or mental health issues, like Thomas mentioned his depression, but there are many other things like anxiety and other issues that go into that. Personal insecurities can affect sex drive.
Do you have any experience with that?
I have so much experience with this. I can speak into personal insecurities so much. Because for me, sometimes it's hard to want to have sex because I feel unattractive. And of course, maybe I don't know what's going on in your head. You'll have to speak to that yourself. But
so I'll speak to that myself. I look at this woman and I'm like, oh my gosh, she is so beautiful, amazing, sexy. And then when I talk to you about it, you're like, no, you're lying.
You're lying. I'm like, you love me so much. You're looking at me through love colored goggles. That's so nice. But my own personal insecurities can affect my sex drive. And then Thomas can maybe feel undesirable. Do you ever feel undesirable?
I know I'm desirable, baby.
Must be a nice life. You live this like easy life, don't you?
Being married to you is awesome. I'm not going to lie.
But that may not be the case for everyone. Other people may take that and think that it's that, now I'm unattractive or I'm undesirable. But the truth is their spouse is really going through their own personal insecurities. Exhaustion. Wow. Exhaustion can really, really affect your sex life and your sex drive.
That might be the thing. Well, that and having our kids around constantly. The thing that affects us the most.
Exhaustion.
Yeah.
Are we getting old? I mean,
Well, I'm
only
old.
37, so
I know I'm getting old.
Of course, to all of those 25-year-olds out there listening, I'm very old at 37.
Well, and your schedule plays a big part in that. Like I get up very early to make sure that I can get to the gym.
How early do you get up?
4:30. So I get up early and make sure I get to the gym before you might need the car for something.
So put it this way, we're not having morning sex.
No, we're not. And
3:30 a.m.
yes. And so by the time it's time to lay down at night, I'm done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
exhaustion can play a big part.
Just the other night, his plan was, okay, we're gonna have some fun time in the evening.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I hear,
I did.
He
I
was
made
snoring
sure
so
the
loud.
girls were taking the dog to their room and everything. But yeah,
so exhaustion, that plays a part. But this kind of stuff should be talked about so that your spouse is not creating their own ideas about what's happening in your sex drive. You may just need to have the conversation. And if your sex drive is gone, it doesn't mean that your spouse is all set. They might be
Yeah.
over there sexually starving.
yeah.
And temptation is much, much greater when we aren't fulfilled. So you need to be talking about how you can fulfill your spouse's needs one way or the other.
Yeah. Because once again, you have that responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get married, you make these promises to your spouse. You promise to be there for them, to provide for them, to love them. And sex is a way to love and provide for your spouse. Believe it or not, sex can be a comfort to your spouse. We counseled a couple who had lost a baby, and they went through this like great trauma. Mm-hmm. And some of you out there are very familiar with that experience. But the wife explained that sex was a way for her husband to comfort her after losing the baby. Mm-hmm. And that was what really helped her through that. Sex shows love and comfort. And if you aren't providing for your spouse the way that they need, it's not too late. So you may have to acknowledge your negligence in this area, ask for forgiveness, and begin to discuss your spouse's needs and seek to meet them as often as needed.
Mm-hmm. So before Thomas and I got married, we had conversations about sex, and I would say that we were pretty prepared as far as communicating about it and knowing what we thought about going into it.
Yeah.
But one of the problems that I had for probably, I'm going to say 15 years of our marriage was...
And we're at 19 now, so that's most of our marriage.
Most of our marriage. So before we got married, we talked about how many times we thought would be a good amount of sex to have a week, and that would mean a healthy relationship.
I think we settled on 3, right?
I think we said 3 times a week, which some of you out there are like, 3 times? That's nothing.
Yeah.
And other people out there are like, whoa, 3 times?
What?
That's a lot.
3 times a month.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what your magic number is there, but for us, we were like, okay, if we have sex 3 times a week, we are a healthy marriage. Before we got married, we talked about
I
that.
don't know where we got that idea either.
I don't know either. We must have heard it somewhere. I don't know. Anyway, so because we talked about that, my thought was I'm going to be a good wife and make sure that we have a healthy sex life, and I'm going to be there for my husband. And so I kept track of how often we had sex, not with a calendar, but in my mind constantly. I wanted to make sure we had a healthy sex life. So if it wasn't often enough and Sunday was coming and the end of the week was coming, I made sure that I instigated sex however many times I needed to hit that magic number. And what I didn't know is it was driving me mad. I mean, I was crazy thinking, trying to keep track of it, trying to make sure it happened.
I can't even imagine what you were going through mentally with all of that.
Yeah, for 15 years. It was exhausting, but it's very typical of me and my neurotic behavior. So
Yeah, and that's true.
I mean, you were pretty happy that I was instigating as often
Oh,
as
yeah,
I
totally.
did. But the truth was there were times when neither of us really needed it. And I was kind of like forcing it just to make sure we were healthy. And I say that in quotes.
Well, it was just kind of naive of us to think that over the course of your life, nothing's ever going to change.
It's so naive.
I mean, now we have 4 kids, and unfortunately, our kids like to spend time with us.
Oh, it's such a problem.
It is. It can be, as far as sex is concerned, because everywhere you turn, they're right there with you.
Yeah. Well, and I thought that the hardest part of our lives as far as having opportunities to have sex was going to be when our kids were little, because they're so dependent and needy. But that is not true. Because they're little, but they're also unaware.
And we can just put on a Disney cartoon and they would sit there, because we didn't just have them sit in front of TV all the time. So when the TV was on, that was a big deal, and they were hooked.
They became zombies.
So we could go do whatever we wanted to do.
For about 90 minutes. We had, turn on that movie.
90 minutes? What do you do with the other
Watch it.
85 minutes?
Yeah, right.
But they were fine, but now we can't do that. Like, our kids want to watch TV with us. Mm-hmm. They want to spend time with us.
Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that we can do for our kids to make them like distracted for a long amount of time.
And they are hyper aware of everything that's going on.
The second we start to whisper, their ears perk up and they listen.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's very frustrating. But anyway, so you're going to have seasons. You're going to have seasons about how often you can or want to have sex. And you have to communicate that. You can't just be like, okay, we're going to have sex 3 times a week. And that is what is good and healthy for both of us forever.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. You have to talk about it and communicate. And so some questions you can ask are, do you feel like we're having sex enough? How often do you wish we were having sex? And just talk about that. Ask those questions.
Yeah. And we should be available to our spouse when they desire sex. And once again, we talked about these verses that were shared. And one of the things that Paul says is, hey, don't defraud one another, except it be with consent for a time. And so it's something that we've personally agreed on. So you can think about that word consent there is the idea both partners are consenting to have sex or to abstain from sex. Mm-hmm. So once again, as we mentioned earlier, and we mention it often when we talk about this topic, is you ought to have consent. You should, this is a conversation we shouldn't have to have, but look at the statistics that are out there. Mm-hmm. It's a conversation we have to have about consent, even among married couples. Is you should not force anybody to do anything they're uncomfortable with. If my wife's not comfortable with something, then we shouldn't be doing it. If I'm not comfortable with something, then we shouldn't be doing it. And so it's, hey, we're consenting to have sex. We're consenting to these sexual activities or whatever else. Or, hey, we're both agreeing that for this time, we're going to abstain from our physical needs so that maybe we can concentrate on a spiritual thing. Or, hey, my wife is going through this very hard, difficult physical issue. Okay, for a certain amount of time, we're going to abstain from sex. But it's all about that consent. And then you come back together before one or both of you are tempted to immorality. And he talks about the fact that, hey, a lack of sex in a relationship can be an open door to temptation and issues and problems. Now, that's not an excuse.
Right.
We all make our own choices. But he warns us that can be an opportunity for a crack to open up in your relationship. And so that means whether it's sex with somebody else, whether that's pornography or whatever else, you can allow these things in that shouldn't be in, because you're not taking care of your responsibility and meeting the needs of your partner.
That's right. And when talking about sex before you have sex, you may have to discuss the practical side to making it happen. You might have to talk about your schedule. You might have to put it on the calendar. And I know that doesn't sound as like
romantic
and spontaneous and fun as what you maybe have seen on movies or television.
Well, and if it's just the two of you, you've got a better chance of having this spontaneous thing happening. But when you have 4 kids that are involved in sports and activities and all these different things, and like I said, that for whatever reason actually enjoy spending time with you, it can be difficult. In fact, this is one of the conversations we were having yesterday when we were communicating about sex with each other is, okay, what can we do to find some time for each other?
It's crazy. It shouldn't be this difficult, it feels like, but it is.
No, but it's literally sometimes like solving a mystery. It's almost, it's
a Rubik's Cube.
Seriously, it's almost like, teenagers trying to sneak out and get together with each other. Except for we're married and it's not our parents we're trying to run from and sneak out. We're sneaking away from our kids.
It's so true and so weird.
And so
yeah,
we kind of came up with a solution, but that's none of your business. So we're not going to tell you what it was. But we had a conversation about it.
I'm so happy that there is at least something that's none of our listeners' business.
For now, yes.
Oh my. Almost everything, we are an open book. But thank God we have a few boundaries. I'm happy to hear you say that's none of your business. That's beautiful, babe. Thank you. I just never know what he's going to say. But anyway, you might have to get practical and get out the calendar, get out the schedule and say, okay, tonight it's going to happen because all the kids are going over to their cousin's house or whatever you got to say. But go ahead and make a schedule if that's what you have to be, if you have to do.
It used to be volleyball practice.
Oh my.
That would give us a chance. But now the kids are done with that. So
yeah. Okay. So you might have to make an appointment for sex. But here's some good questions to ask. Do you have time today? Or do you have time tomorrow? Can we schedule this? How are you feeling? Do you have enough energy for sex right now? Are you too exhausted? Do you have a headache?
Oh, headache. Here we go. Yeah. We have this joke between the two of us that every time Lysandra says she has a headache, my reply is always the exact same. Message received.
Yeah.
I know you don't want any action tonight or today or this morning or whatever.
Sometimes I just have a headache.
Yeah. Sometimes you do, but it seems like you have a lot of headaches.
I do have a lot of headaches sometimes.
Most of them are caused by me, but...
Right, exactly. So you're the problem is what I'm hearing.
Everybody just knows that I'm the problem. Other issues that you want to have a conversation about before having sex are fears. And I remember the first time we had sex, there was some fear involved, like, what's this going to be like and all these sorts of things, the pain involved and all those things that they don't show you on TV shows and movies and whatever else. But you may have some fears. And once again, some of that stuff may go back to abuse and all kinds of stuff. So having those conversations are important. Maybe hang-ups. Like for you, that's, hey, listen, this is a no-go. Definitely, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. This is okay. All right, that sounds good. But this is a definite buzzer noise on that one. So maybe you talk about...
I provide sound effects.
Yes, you do. In our relationship as well. Maybe you need to have some conversations about fantasies. And listen, don't be afraid to tell your spouse if you have a fantasy. Now, your fantasy should be about them.
Oh my goodness.
We've already had this conversation.
My fantasy is that you would wear a mask of this very popular actor.
Yeah.
No, that is not that's not the kind of fantasy we're talking about.
Yeah. Thankfully, they don't sell Paul Walker masks, but
would you stop it?
Most likely, they'll be so happy you shared that they'll jump at the opportunity to fulfill your desire.
Right. And we counseled a couple who, just a really precious couple that we love so much, but they were trying to recover from multiple affairs. And the wife had stepped out on her husband multiple times with multiple partners for multiple years. And there was a lot to work through and a lot to heal from. But one thing that came out during counseling was that she felt like he was a prude and he wouldn't be interested in her fantasies. So she didn't share them with him, and she sought out people who would be interested. And sure enough, she found people that would be interested in her fantasies. But one of the big problems was that she never shared her fantasies with him and gave him the opportunity. And he even said, if I had known, I would have been happy to do anything she wanted. I just didn't know. So the key here again is you have to talk about everything.
So most of this episode has been about talking before sex. And if you have those conversations, that will make your sex life so much better. Even if it's just, hey, talking about your sexual life together as a kind of precursor to getting into it. But now we're kind of, the next couple of things we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of go through them pretty quickly, but they are also as important. And the next thing is to talk during sex. And communication should also take place during sex. And your spouse should not be guessing about what you like or what you don't like. It's your responsibility to communicate your likes and dislikes in whatever way you need to. And once again, you have to fight against this idea that sex is bad, it's wrong, you shouldn't enjoy it. God literally made it for you to enjoy. So it's okay to talk about what you like, what turns you on, what makes you happy, what makes you feel good. Those are all good conversations that you ought to be having with one another. But you can use this time to provide affirmation and encouragement to your spouse. Like, oh yeah, that's good. Like, okay, that's great. You can offer guidance as well. Okay. Like,
I'm like,
okay,
now, be careful. What are you saying here?
okay, that's not it. And guide them into what you want. And it's also a time to share any abuse triggers that may come up. And one of the things that we encourage spouses, especially of sexual abuse, to do is to kind of sit down and take it slow. To, hey, depending upon the severity of the abuse, you may have to literally start by, okay, let's just sit down on the bed together. And how does this make you feel? Do you feel safe? Do you feel comfortable? While you're sitting there, hold hands. Okay, how are you feeling now? And be able to talk through some of these issues, kissing and moving on and progressing in your sexual relationship. But if your spouse has been the victim of especially severe abuse, you're going to have a lot of conversation during sex, a lot of asking permission to do things, a lot of asking for feedback of, okay, how does that make you feel now? And just being very gentle, being very thoughtful, being very considerate of your partner and what they've been through. But you have to be willing and open to communicating constantly throughout your time together. And hey, sharing if something happens that makes you uncomfortable or triggers uncomfortable memories, or, hey, you know what? I just really don't like that. And just having those conversations, but you have to be willing to communicate all throughout. All right. Any other things you want to say about talking during sex?
No, I think you covered that very well. It's a good thing, though. It's definitely helped our sex life improve a lot over the years. But we also believe, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about on this episode, is you need to talk after.
And this is where we get down to this great illustration.
Yes, the great illustration that you had.
And for all of our sports fans out there, One of the things that top athletes do is they review the game film, review the tape.
What are you telling our listeners to do?
I mean, you can tape if you want. I would suggest being very careful with that. But I'm saying after you've had sex, whether that's immediately after or later on or whatever, talk about the entire experience.
Yep.
And just communicate afterward. It was funny because when I gave that illustration in the Sweet Talk, everybody was like, especially the guys, they were like, oh.
They were pretty happy about that one.
Yeah. So I wasn't actually telling people to tape each other. But if it's by consent, that is okay.
Just be really careful what you do with that. Yes. So we need to have a time of communication after sex. And I feel like this has really expedited the improvement of our sexual lives together. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Definitely. So it's all fresh in your mind. It just happened. You also are at this point feeling very close to one another, hopefully. You should be. I know that we do right after. And so it's a great time to really talk about it. You can talk about, okay, what did we like? What did we not like? What did you do well? And this does provide your spouse with some encouragement. And it also makes them feel fulfilled as a successful sexual partner.
Like, what do you want to do differently? What do you want to try? Like, just having these conversations about it afterward.
That's right. And maybe not immediately after, but after a little time has passed, you may need to talk about what led up to that time of sex. This happened recently in our lives where I had to communicate something with Thomas. It was a very busy day, and you were very, I guess I'll say self-involved. Like you were involved with your own work and your own schedule that day.
Had a lot going on that day.
Yeah. And there was not a lot of interaction between the two of us. You know, I would be down here doing dishes. He's in his office working. And it was like that all day. There was a time period when, during the day, when I was spending some time with the girls playing games and you were just on the couch. Like you just didn't want to participate. And that was how it felt all day. And then at night you rolled over and you were like, let's do this.
I
came knocking. And I had to share with Thomas later after. I didn't share with him at that moment because I was okay. I wasn't like super angry, but I wanted to explain to him that in the future, I would like you to show me some attention throughout the day, or at least a little bit before you come knocking. Like in the future, and this is something that we can talk about after sex, is in the future, I would like to feel valued and loved before this takes place next time. And that might be something you can talk about after sex, is what led up to it and how it could be better. And we will be doing an episode on getting in the mood and that kind of thing. That's going to be coming.
Is that
later.
Next episode or?
It is not next episode.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna pace out these kind of episodes, babe.
Okay.
Sorry, you'll have to just suffer through some other episodes on other topics.
What are some questions maybe we can ask? Because for some people, maybe just having the conversation, if they've never had a conversation afterward about it, maybe having some questions they can ask would be helpful.
Yeah. So here's some questions. You can write these down or put them on your notepad in your phone. Here's some good questions for after having sex. Did you feel safe? What did you like? What didn't you like? What do you want to try next time? How can I do better? How can I help you get in the mood next time? You could also have some statements. So not just questions, but this was my favorite part. Or I really like it when you do this. You can also give some statements there. But those are some questions and some statements that can help the conversation get going if you aren't used to communicating with each other after sex. But I promise it really will help you. And
so for your family meeting tonight, it's going to be a family meeting with just you and your spouse. So leave the kids out of this one. Mm-hmm. But talk about any sexual experiences from your past that you need to share with your spouse. So if you've not fully opened up and talked about it, then you need to. Talk about how often you would like to have sex each week in this period of your life. So we're not saying, hey, from now on, As we've already talked about, that doesn't work. But for each season in your life and what's going on, there's going to be different needs, different desires, different wants. So have a conversation about that. Talk about what kind of affirmation would help you during sex. And this is a conversation Lysandra and I had to have, that she's explaining, like, I need more verbal affirmation from you. Talk about your favorite part of foreplay. And having that conversation. We're going to do an episode about, hey, getting in the mood. Well, that's part of it. Well, you can start to have that conversation right now. Talk about what you would like to change about your sexual relationship in the future and what you think will make it even better.
Thanks for joining us today. Please go and subscribe to the Family Meeting Podcast from your favorite podcast provider. And if you found this information to be helpful, please share this episode on social media and invite your friends and family to listen in with you.
To find more content and information Lysandra and I provide, you can go to our website, familymeeting.org. And one of the things you'll see there is we have next year's relationship refresh on the website, so you can get that on your calendar. Right now, that's July 21st and 22nd, 2023 in Orlando. And we had a couple come all the way down from Missouri, spend some time with us at Relationship Refresh this past year, and we want to invite you to join us as well. If you have any questions or thoughts, podcast ideas, you can shoot us an email, info@familymeeting.org, or text or call us at 904-257-3062.
And we want to invite you to join us for our next family meeting as we talk about socioeconomic status. This affects our physical and mental health, and we're going to look into what makes your child a success and how do you personally measure success. Is there a way to measure your child's success correctly or incorrectly? We're going to talk about that next week.
Thanks for joining us today for this family meeting. Have a great week, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.
Bam. All right, we got to wrap it up with the YouTubers quick because I need to go to the bathroom.
I don't think they really needed to know that.
I know, but hurry.
But you did talk about the fact that we openly share with our podcast listeners. We more openly share with our YouTube watchers.
Yes, which can be a good or bad thing.
So you really get the inside scoop of what goes on behind the scenes. And so sometimes we tickle people until they wet their pants.
Bye, guys.
So thank you for joining us today. I am the last man standing at the family meeting, which means I can now say whatever I want to say, and Lysandra's not here to stop me. But I'm going to be good. So what I'm going to say to you is, have a great week. We'll see you next time.